So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed your lunch and you've enjoyed the conference so far. This is actually the first talk I've ever done for this company, so bear with me. It's all a kind of new technology domain for me. A little bit about myself. So my name is Jamie Coleman. I work as a developer advocate. I used to work at IBM on lots of random stuff. So my first job was mainframes, which is a bit of a shock to the system when you come out of university, but hey ho. Then I worked in Java a lot, so containerization of our products. So I was one of the first people to containerize an IBM product when Docker had just become a thing. Worked with WebSphere, OpenJ9, and yeah, now I'm at Sonotype, and we're a security company. So hands up here, who's heard of Sonotype before? Most of you, okay. So, as you all probably know, we are the people who run Maven Central. So a little bit of history about Sonotype. So the CTO and the co-founder of Sonotype was one of the original Maven contributors. So he was one of the original people who created Maven. Now, at the time, great, Maven was a great build tool, but then he went and thought, okay, we need like a central repository for this. So he went and created Maven Central, which he was actually running on a computer under his desk for about 2 years, which you probably all don't know. So he was running Maven Central for 2 years. And then, of course, it got a bit big. So then we had to move to the cloud. So now it runs on AWS. And the reason he created Sonotype was he saw a problem with this open source world we're in now. And the problem of that was open source is great, we're all sharing code, but it's very easy for these things to become vulnerable. And nobody was checking what they were using, nobody was checking anything. So that's when he built Sonotype. So Sonotype has lots of different products. The one you're probably most familiar with is Nexus. Hands up here, anyone who's used Nexus before? Okay, cool, about half of you, awesome. But it's not just Nexus we do lots of other stuff. We have Firewall, which does things like checking your dependencies, creating policy management to make sure they haven't got vulnerabilities, all kinds of stuff like that. But I'm not here to pitch to you about Sonotype, I'm here to pitch to you about something I heard at a conference that really shocked me to my core a little bit. And you won't find much information about this online, probably because it's such a bad practice that people don't want to talk about it. But we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to talk about why open source is great to start with, some of the supply chain problems we're having today. Then we're going to talk about software composition analysis, what that is, some of the tools for that, what they do, and a little demo of Bomb Doctor, which is a completely free experimental tool from Sonotype. Then we're going to talk about why security matters in open source, a little bit about the upcoming legislation, which you probably don't care about, but you will have to in the next few years. A little bit about what SBOMs are, security posture. Then I'm going to talk about raw materials, which is kind of the part of this talk which I overheard and had conversations with at a conference I didn't realize even existed. Then we're going to talk about, if we have time, static analysis tools. I'll hopefully give you a demo of a free one we have at Sonotype, and then obviously some summary and links at the end. So why did I create this talk? So this talk, basically I was at quite a big developer conference, and we were sat down at a round table with some very, very big corporations, and I won't name who they are, but they were talking essentially about how they can get around policy with dependency management and the ways they were essentially getting around this. And from that, I was completely befounded that people were trying to basically get around policy just so they can get open source code into their applications. So from this, I kind of went away and thought, you know what, I'm going to create a talk about this. It's been a bit challenging because, like I said, none of this information is available online. You will find, I've got a few links at the end so you can have a little research yourself, but yeah. So open source, we all love open source, right? Open source is amazing. Open source has been around for a while, so a little bit of history of open source here. It actually really started in 1953 when a company essentially shipped its software. Back in then, I don't know what media device it would have been, but they would have shipped it to their customer and they were asking their customer for feedback. And they were asking all their customers for feedback so they could then take that feedback and put it into the project. So this was kind of the first way where we had people using free software and going back to the company who made it essentially to say, we want this to change, we want that to change, and the community kind of coming together. Now, open source has changed a lot since then, and I think the real thing that changed open source for me was GitHub. GitHub really made a big difference. It made it easy for us all to contribute, made us all to create pull requests and manage all these things. So GitHub for me was really the change that really changed the world in terms of open source. And open source is amazing. You know, if you've got proper open source software, it allows you to study it, copy it, modify, redistribute. You can sometimes have less bugs, or they're found quicker because you've got a big community using it. And no cost, it's free, right? So open source is amazing in lots and lots of ways. And imagine if we didn't have open source now. So if you look at a lot of applications, I think we did a study that said nearly 90% of all applications, 90% of the code is open source code. So we're actually writing about 10% of our applications these days. And that's great because we're saving the amount 90% of the time that we didn't have to write all this stuff, and we're just borrowing it from each other. And of course, sharing makes the world a better place. So open source is amazing. But like I mentioned, there is a few problems with open source. So first of all, the average Java project has about 150 dependencies, and those dependencies have about 10 releases per year. That's 1,500 updates to consider per year in a basic Java project. So that can get a bit confusing. And then, not on top of that, you have dependencies that require other dependencies. So you have your main dependency, which you incorporate, but then that dependency might require another 3 dependencies, and those dependencies might require another 5. So it gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. And the bad people in the world, the hackers, the cyber criminals, they know that, and they're taking advantage of that in many, many ways. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but they are attacking us at different stages of our pipeline, essentially, of our supply chain. And that gets a bit worrying. Now, there's a few different ways they do this. They either do dependency confusion, where they're essentially add a different version, the binary, often latest, which you will automatically pull down. There's also typo squatting, where they'll create, say, essentially the same library, but with a slight difference in the spelling, and you, as a user, might accidentally pull that down. So that is a way they get vulnerabilities into our systems. Now, there are more painful attacks, stuff like open source repo attacks, where they will actually just get their vulnerabilities into repositories, which we pull down and trust. And there's build tools attacks as well. So, you know, we're all using open source build tools. They can get these vulnerabilities into those build tools, which will automatically plant those vulnerabilities into our application code. So there's a lot of different ways they can attack us now. And of course, we've now moved to microservices. Yay! Just to make things even more difficult, now we have to manage lots and lots of services, whereas before we would just be managing one. So as you can imagine, the hackers of the world are taking advantage of this. The days are changing where they're just brute forcing their way in, and now they're getting very sophisticated. For example, they will pretend to be an open source committer. They will befriend the community. They'll be there looking like, you know, they're adding stuff to the product. But then a year down the line, they can be like, right, I'm going to put a vulnerability in now, and nobody will realize because they trust that person. So they're getting very, very more advanced in the way they're essentially attacking our software. So software composition analysis, I'm going to use the cake analogy here. So what is software composition analysis? It's essentially the ability to look through your applications and see what's inside. And there are different tools that do different things and different levels of this. So first of all, imagine I'm looking at my software. Imagine the cake's my software. And I can tell from these pictures that we've got sponge, we've got icing, and maybe some cream in the middle. That's what I can see, right? And that's essentially what basic software analysis tools do. So they'll list all the declared dependencies you've got in your POM file, and they'll give you some basic information about each, so what version it is, etc. Now, more advanced tools, for example, they will look at transitive dependency, so what dependencies your dependencies need, etc. They'll give you vulnerability and license data. They will give you stuff like project scoring. So if you've looked at OSS scorecard, etc., they'll have a look at that and see if you're creating your project in the right way. They'll provide visualizations to allow you to visualize this, because looking at text in terms of dependency management can get a bit boring. Of course, got license data, so they can tell you if you're allowed to use these projects, and some of them can produce SBOMs as well. So I'm going to try and give you a very, very quick demo of a free open source tool, internet depending here. All right, so what I'm going to have to do is close my presentation, remember the slide, And then I should be able to go to my browser. You see that, everybody? Yes, okay, cool. So this is Bomb Doctor, and Bomb Doctor takes a slightly different approach. What it does, and it's all free, it's experimental as well, so if you hit any issues, do let us know. And we are trying very hard to add as much functionality in this as possible. But what it does is it allows you to visualize your dependencies. So we've got some sample applications here. I presume a few of you have used Spring Boot before. And what it does is it'll use data from scorecard and lots of other metrics to give that project a score. So this score is not only the vulnerability data, but it's how that project is created, how it's developed. We looked at lots of different things. And what this allows you to do is essentially go through this dependency list, because of course I'm just including Spring Boot starter. But then from that's then including all these. It's then including all of these. So this can be a bit painful to look at without the right tool to do so. Bomb Doctor is great because it will give you updates, auto updates and things like that. The only thing it won't let you do is if there's a breaking change, it will not say that you need to do that update, because obviously it could break your code. But it will still say there is an update available, but it contains a breaking change. And then you can decide if that breaking change is going to break your application or not. So that was a very, very brief overview of what Bomb Doctor does. Again, you can update stuff. You can get an SBOM report from this as well, get all information about the different dependencies, etc. So that is my very, very quick demo of Bomb Doctor in the essence of time. I'm now back on. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to throw you some horrible, scary facts to hopefully make you consider security a little bit more. So, in 2016, cybercrime surpassed the drug trade in terms of how much money it makes. And that was an estimated $450 billion a year. That's $14,000 a second, and that's equivalent to buying 50 of the world's biggest aircraft carriers. That was in 2016. So if we go to 2022, which is where I have the data from, yes, that's got a lot bigger. So now it's equivalent to $6 trillion $6 trillion a year. That's $200,000 a second. That's equivalent to 620 of the world's biggest nuclear aircraft carriers. Imagine if one cyber criminal had that money. He could pretty much wage war with anyone he wanted. So it's a very scary fact that this is how much money is literally disappearing through cybercrime. And if cybercrime was a country, it would have the third highest GDP in the world. So hopefully this is scaring you a little bit to consider a little bit more that you should think about security. And yeah, I love this quote, but if Pablo Escobar was around today, he'd be using a laptop, because there's a lot more money in cybercrime than there is in the drug trade nowadays. So another problem is the 0-day window is closing. You now don't have a week to wait before a vulnerability comes out and it's noticed. You don't have 2 weeks to wait. You don't have a month. It's now down to about a few days. So you really, when a vulnerability is found, you really have to act very quickly. And we all probably remember the Log4j vulnerability last year. So what devices, so I'm talking about open source code here. So what devices contain open source code? Well, that's pretty much everything. Healthcare devices, aircraft, cars, trains, anything you name it, open source code is in there. Now, there is some standards that has to be abided by. For example, medical devices. You can't just go to Maven Central and pull down a library and put it into, say, an insulin pump or something like that. But it is quite scary how much open source code we're using and how little enterprises and corporations are paying attention to the security side of stuff. So a little bit of a boring part here about legislation. Anyone hear about the directive from the USA government that came out last week, I think it was? Yep. Okay, so this is not just a USA thing. This is going to be a worldwide thing. So do pay attention. And there's no point waiting for these laws to become in place. You might as well get started now and start making the changes to your applications, because you will be forced to. And if you don't do it, you just won't be able to sell your applications in the future. So what came out of the US? Well, basically, they're now making you as a company responsible for your security. Whereas before we could go, oh, okay, it was the open source. We didn't create it, so it's not our fault. That's not the case anymore. You are now responsible. If there is a vulnerability in your open source code in the next 2 years, you are going to be held responsible for it by the government. And this is in the US. Now, the EU has a pretty similar directive. They're looking, I'm not going to go through all these, but they're looking at, again, holding people responsible, making sure you're reporting any vulnerabilities straight away to your customers, to your users, handling vulnerability requirements. So if you can't upgrade, you need to explain why, etc. So this isn't just a US thing. This EU Cyber Resiliency Act is coming into force as well. And of course, UK is following suit with a similar thing. The one I like from the UK is they're banning default passwords. So I don't know why we still use default passwords, but when you have a device and it comes with, change me password or something like that, that is not good because a lot of people don't change those passwords. So this is becoming law in the UK that is no longer the case. You can't have default passwords. Now, you've probably all heard of SBOMs. SBOMs are great. It stands for Software Bills of Material. They're really good, but they are not the solution to our problems. They are just a small part of the solution. Because if you're creating an SBOM and not doing anything with it, what is really the point of that SBOM, right? So you need to act on the data that the SBOM provides. There's lots of different ways you can easily generate an SBOM. You've got the Cyclone DX Maven plugin, Kubernetes, Microsoft, etc. There's lots of ways you can generate them. But even our SBOMs aren't safe. People can hack our SBOMs. People can get in there and change them, which tricks us. So there's a lot of work going on to figure out how to secure SBOMs, etc. But even the SBOMs nowadays we have aren't safe. So it's quite scary. Now, this is changing. The world has kind of forgotten about security. We all hide behind our firewalls and think we're all safe. That's not the case. So about 6 months ago, only 2 of these organizations existed. Like you can see, over the last 6 months, a lot of organizations have come out to basically figure out a way to create standards to handle all these security problems we're having around the world. Now, it's not that difficult to increase your security posture. So this is a study from the Sonotype supply chain report that we do once a year. And these are some of the metrics of things that we look at for identifying vulnerable projects. And as you can see, things like, for example, code reviews. Like, who are not doing code reviews? So code reviews is a simple way for us to look at an open source project and go, that's probably got a vulnerability in if they're not doing code reviews. Dependencies pinned to a specific version, that is not good either. Secure branches. So you have no idea how many projects are going around with not secure branches. It's quite scary, to be honest. But these are just really simple ways you can improve an open source project's security posture. So quite simple to kind of get started with. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the main point of this, which is what are raw materials. So like I said, I was at a round table at a conference, and there were some big corporations there talking about essentially how they get around some of their policy management. And these were corporations that are involved in telecoms, they're involved in healthcare, they're involved in a lot of different things. And essentially, this is your normal supply chains. You'll have your supplier. You'll get it from, say, Maven Central or somewhere, etc. You generally know who's managing that project. You can generally look at the health of it, how it's developed, etc. But a lot of these corporations have these policy management systems in place. But to get around them, basically, they've created a concept of something called raw materials, or it's also called SOUP, software of unknown provenance. And this allows them to get around their policy checks to get this open source code into their applications. And I kind of sat there and thought, wow. I was like, what if, I said, like, what if, you find a vulnerability down the road and they're like, oh, it's okay. We've declared it as a raw material, so it's not our problem. And I was like, that is a really bad attitude to have. And again, these are really big corporations that are doing this. So if you think these are kind of 8 themes to kind of good software management practices, and essentially raw materials are getting around policy control and supplier hygiene, because we have no idea these raw materials, the hygiene, how it's being developed, anything like that. I mean, they could have been developed 5 years ago and the developers or whoever just stopped doing it. But again, it's not a good excuse to put something down as a raw material just to get by your policy controls. You should either go and find another open source project that does what you need to do, or you can't write the code yourself. But putting unknown code in just because it's open source into your application is not good. For example, small mistakes can have massive impacts. Like one of these one of these lines is a vulnerability and one of them is not a vulnerability. And we've all done this. We've all accidentally put a symbol in, etc. But that is the difference between a vulnerability and not. So making sure that your applications are developed in the right way, you've got code reviews, and that's what code reviews are for, is to pick up things like this to stop these vulnerabilities happening and people hacking our applications. So static analysis tools, these things are absolutely amazing. Essentially what they are there to do is to kind of enforce programming practices, I'd say. I'm not going to use the word good, but I'm going to say coding standards. They can look at insecure coding patterns. They can measure test coverage. They can even measure like how you've written your documentation and the requirements from that. So these are really, really good tools. I don't think I've really heard about many of them 10 years ago, but now there's quite a lot of companies creating this. So another little demo, and I'm going to use both tools here. So this is Sonotype Lift, which is a free tool, free for open source projects. It's really great because it supports Java, and we will be supporting Python, I think, in the next week or so. But what it does is go through your application and basically look for anything that's out of the ordinary, any bad programming practices, things like that. So this is Sonotype Lift. I've run a scan against microprofile config this morning. Not a very big open source project, microprofile config. And as you can see, it's provided me with some things to change, which could be good for, say, security, things like that in our open source projects. Now, what we can do from here is we can create a SBOM. So it reports a Cyclone DX SBOM. So as we can see, this is not a bad project. There's only one vulnerability in here. Yes, it's high, but it's not critical. And that's a pretty well-written project. I probably should have picked a well-written project. But you can go down and find out more information about what's in the project, things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this SBOM, and I'm going to copy it into Bomb Doctor. So again, Bomb Doctor, you don't have to do this. You can just point it at a project you have, but I am going to use the SBOM I just created. All right, so if I drop that in there, Bomb Doctor will do some thinking, and then it should show me, the dependencies of microprofile config. And I've not done it here. All I did here was fork the microprofile config repository, put it into install Lift into my GitHub. Lift scanned it, told me there's a few things you can change. Export the SBOM and then put it into Bomb Doctor. Now, Lift is getting some of Bomb Doctor's functionality put into it, but at the moment, Bomb Doctor is still way ahead. So, and again, I can look at this and see if there's anything here that I need to update, etc. How vulnerable are some of the dependencies that included? And again, this is just one small dependency, which includes all these dependencies. So it can be quite painful to look through some of this stuff. And this is why I think visualizations are very, very important in terms of managing our dependencies. So those are just two simple tools here. We can get an SBOM report from this, put it into PDF format. And again, it'll show us license information, vulnerability information, and then provide any updates that are possible to update. So I think I've spoken very, very quickly here because I'm nearly at the end of my presentation. So I'm going to quickly summarize this. This is going to be, I took this data yesterday. This is actually increased. So as the stewards of Maven Central, we can see everything people are doing. We can see everything people are downloading. Now, what this graph represents is this is the vulnerable log4j dependency that came out last year. And 29% of downloads of log4j in the last 24 hours have been that vulnerable dependency. Now, that is a scary fact that 29% of people are still pulling down the dependency that pretty much brought the world to its heels last Christmas. So, well, the Christmas before. So for me, that is quite a scary fact. And that's why I'm here today to preach to you all to do better at dependency management. I'm sure everyone here is, on top of their dependencies, but that number there states that 29% of people aren't. And one day your luck will run out. One day you will be hacked. And today, when you get hacked and they take down your entire system, your company's gone bankrupt. Unless you're working for a big corporation, that can be the end of your company. So my point here is, please, please, please do check your dependencies as much as possible and don't be using vulnerable versions like these 29% of people. There's lots of different ways you can do this, but the main things I want you to take here is check what's in your application. If you're not doing anything with dependency management, find a tool that does that. Assess any existing dependencies. Create a continuous upgrade strategy. Don't put it to latest, because latest could then obviously get a version that could have a vulnerability in, but have that strategy there. Have ongoing security scanning. So, for example, when you pull down a dependency, have a tool check that dependency. Does it include any vulnerabilities? What are the severity of those vulnerabilities? Are there any alternative open source libraries I can use? And have a remediation strategy. So if all hell does break loose and you realize, oh, damn, I've got a vulnerability, it has got a dependency, and it's got a vulnerable critical vulnerability in, have a strategy to get that changed as quick as possible. Because like I mentioned before, the time before a hacker figures out that something's got a vulnerability and the time that they hack you is getting smaller and smaller all the time. Now, there are some useful links here, and if you want to know a little bit more about the open source stuff that's in medical devices and the raw materials, the two top links there will take you to some great articles. But like I said, this is a difficult subject to talk about because people don't like to post things about this online. Nobody wants to turn around and post an article saying that they get around their policy management systems by declaring stuff as raw materials. But so the reason I came up with this talk was because I was around a round table and I was completely shocked at how big these corporations are and what they were doing here. So honestly, do go check out those articles because it's also a bit scary, the amount of open source that goes into medical devices. The State of the Software Supply Chain is a great report. Basically, we scan, of course, we have all the Maven data, so we can compile a really, really great report to tell users what's going on in the world. If you want to see that log4j data, you can. It's all on the websites. Currently, it says 31% of people have downloaded that vulnerability in the last 24 hours. So yeah, it's not great. And in that time, there's been 157 million downloads of that vulnerable package, not in 24 hours, but since it was released. So that's quite a scary fact. Sonotype, like I mentioned, we are a security company specialized in dependency security. I think since we've existed, we've found and created vulnerability data for something like 30,000 security vulnerabilities. We have an amazing security research team that literally they go through all the data, any new dependency that a customer has that we have never recognized before. They go through that and they follow a brilliant method for going through that and basically finding if something's vulnerable or not. And hackers and developers that do this are getting very, very clever at trying to hide that. Many times it will go and call a function that will go off to a remote server, which will pull something down, which will then gain access to your application. So do be careful. But yeah, feel free to get in touch. We're on social media as always. So Twitter, LinkedIn, things like that. And if you want to have a really good read about SBOMs and software composition analysis, we have a series on FUJ, which is really, really good, which is expanding. But the first 3 articles we released over the last couple of weeks explaining this in a little bit more detail. So if you think you need to talk to your security teams and your companies, showing some of these articles on some of these facts may help them consider adding some policy management to their dependencies, because I worked at a company before that they just pulled down whatever they wanted. There was no policy management there whatsoever. Now, of course, when the products get shipped, they go for a lot of testing, but we shouldn't be pulling down vulnerable dependencies onto our development machines at all, regardless. So, something to think about there. And there's also a brilliant blog we do from Sonotype. It's called Malware Monthly, where we go through all the different hacks and all the different malware that's come out in the last month, explain what it is, explain how we figured it out, and give you some ideas of how not to fall victim to that. So that is the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something today, and I hope you go away thinking a little bit more about security in your applications. I'm going to open it up for questions after this, but again, thank you for enjoying my talk. This is the first time I've done a talk regarding this kind of subject before, and it's the first time I've spoken at this conference, which has been fun. But again, think about security, think about dependency management. Open source code is great, it's amazing, but there are bad guys out there, and they are utilizing this kindness that our community has to essentially attack us, because the days of them brute forcing us are slowly coming to an end with all the advancements in firewalls, etc. So now they're getting very creative about how they're doing that. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes. Pardon? Secure branches. Oh, no. Secure branches, essentially the ability to lock down a branch so not anyone can commit to it. So it has to go through a process of something before someone can commit to a branch. But you smiling, there's a lot of people and a lot of projects that just don't secure their GitHub branches, and that is bad. So yeah, whenever you're creating a branch, or if something that you're doing in your pipeline development, make sure it's secure, that people can't just put what they need to. It has to go through a specific process to get into that branch. Make sense? Cool. Any other questions? Yes. Raw materials are libraries that you just say, I'm not going to look at this one? They're libraries that you don't know the origin of, and you don't know, they're libraries that you don't know the origin of, and you don't know how it's developed. So that could be something that was created a while ago and hasn't been touched in a long time. But like I mentioned, corporations are basically to get through their policy management systems, because normally that would flag up and go, we don't know anything, it's not been developed in the right way, it's not adhering to these coding practices, they just get blocked. But these corporations are being lazy. Rather than rewriting that code or making their own library, they're passing it off as something called raw materials, or soup, I think was the other word I used, which basically gets them around that policy system. And they're basically just doing that because they're lazy. And my point, when I was in this talk, in this roundtable, I was like, but what if you find bugs or vulnerabilities later on? And they were like, I will deal with it later on. I was like, but once it's in production and you've been hacked and that hacker takes your company down to the ground and you can't do business for like a month, well, you're regretting, dealing with the problem now rather than later, right? But these were big corporations, so they can handle being hacked. But if you're in a small to medium-sized business and you're held to ransom for a month, it could be the end of your business, right? So yeah, and again, you will struggle to find information about this online, probably because people don't want to say they're doing this, right? So creating this talk, trying to find specific information about raw materials was difficult. There is so like the links I provided, the top two, are really good articles. They are geared more towards medical devices, but it does say how they basically use kind of raw materials or soup to get around that. Now, medical devices, they still do a lot of work to make sure that the code they're using is not going to break, for example, right? If there's an incident pump and all of a sudden someone can hack it, etc., well, that person could die. So they still do a lot of testing around edge cases, etc. But it's still, it's still open source code, and you can't catch everything, right? So yeah, that was just kind of the takeaway I took from that. And I was like, okay, this is scary, the fact that they're doing this. Now, that's probably going to disappear in a few years when the legislation comes out, because when they're now going to be held responsible for the open source libraries they're using, well, I bet you they'll change their minds and they'll make sure they're using the right libraries or writing the code themselves. But until these laws come out and they're in effect, which is probably going to take, I think the US, they said people have got 2 years to do it. And I can't remember how long the EU one was. The UK is always behind, so it's probably like 10 years in the UK, I imagine. But yeah, so these laws, when they come out, that's it. You will have to do it. So it's better to be responsible and get all these policies and this pipeline set up now, rather than reacting to it once the law comes out and realizing you're not compliant in any way, and then you can't sell software to the government and things like that. So yeah. Any other questions? If not, I will give you the rest of the time back and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.